Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome and Happy New Year to you all. I hope in addition to the rigors and joys of the Advent and Christmas season, you've found some time for sabbatical rest and restoration. And we're glad you braved the snow, but also the balmy summer weather we're having today to come out and join us. My name is Skip Masbach. I am the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute, and our mission is to support you, to thank you for what you do, to express our gratitude for the infinitely important work you do with young people, and to provide resources for you that we hope will enrich your ministries even as we learn from you and with you. I've got a couple of things I just want to direct your attention to today before I pass the baton to my partner, Dr. Sarah Farmer. And the first of those is we need to ask a blessing over the food. And don't worry if you've already begun by laying on of hands in apostolic succession. I have the power to retroactively thank God. Okay, so would you pray with me? Dear God of grace and love, made known to us in and through Jesus Christ, we thank you for the spectacular beauty of your creation in this day, for the gift of life to experience it, for the gift of love to share it with you and with our neighbor. We ask your blessing on this food that's set before us. We ask your blessing that we may be attentive to those who in this day have too little or none. We ask you to bless our time together in our table conversations and fellowship, and in our reflections with our scholars who bless us with their presence and wisdom today. May our conversations be pleasing to you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, a couple of things to draw to your attention. How about we want to give you some money? We want to give you some money. And the way we want to give it to you is in 3 competitions that you can participate in, that your colleagues can participate in, and that the young people in your youth ministries can participate in. You'll see these brochures that have been handed out, or you can find them online, as part of this grant generously supported by the John Templeton Foundation. We are sponsoring a sermon series competition, a sermon series on joy. You'll find all the information online or in these brochures, which we'd be glad to give you at the front door, but this has been running for some time, and the deadline is, Sarah, January 31? January 31. But if you notice, the first prize in the series is over $2,000, and there are second and third prizes. Plus, we'll publish your sermon series online and promote it as a resource for folks who are leaning into the question of joy and flourish for young people. Wait, there's more. There's also an essay competition, the essay competition on joy in the midst of youthful celebration and suffering. And again, there's a prize of $2,000, second place prizes, third place prizes, plus we'll publish your essays. And finally, there's a curriculum competition. Surely in the creativity that's present in this room or in the folks who are watching online, you have found ways to create program plans, lesson plans, or structured activities for young people that help shape and nurture their lives of flourish and joy. Once again, $2,000 first prize, second prizes, third prizes, and then we're publishing the entire resource of curriculum materials so that youth ministers all around the world can have access to these curriculum ideas. Please consider entering these competitions, but please do so in the next 2.5 weeks. I want to call your attention to our next month's program. Our monthly lunch and lecture series runs, aside from January, the first Wednesday of every month, and we have some amazing speakers here today and coming next month. Next month, the February lecture is by Dr. David Ford, who is the Regius Professor of Theology at Cambridge University, one of the leading theologians in the world by anybody's estimation, and who has had a particular attentiveness in multiple publications, both scholarly and what they say is a trade press, or for us pastors, on the question of praise. And anybody who's worked their way through Scripture or led worship knows that praise is one of the most fundamental gifts to the people of God in resourcing their celebration and their joy. And he's being joined next month by Reverend Canon Chris Russell. Now, it gives Chris his church affiliation here, which is a lovely thing that he's engaged in ministry to youth in a multi-generational youth ministry. But what's not said here is that Chris Russell is the chief advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury for youth ministry questions and ministry with our young for the Worldwide Anglican Communion. This is going to be an amazing presentation, an amazing team. I hope you'll join us the first Wednesday of February. And we're not slacking after that. The next month in March, we're welcoming Stephanie Paulzell, professor from Harvard, on creativity and imagination. And in April, we're welcoming Tony Campolo and Shane Claiborne on the question of grace as a practice, as an attitude, as a foundation of adolescent joy. So we have amazing programs coming up. And I actually want you to lay your hands on a document you have on your tables. If you would just pick this document up for a second, the one that's got a lighthouse on a blue field. One of the things we're really intent on focusing on in this 3-year lecture series is ministering into the places where our young people are dying, where our young people are suffering. This is not just because we're called as pastors of good news and gospel to minister into suffering, but it's because even in the question of joy, we need to hold on to the notion of how joy can be experienced in the midst of suffering and adversity, and how joy is a resource for resistance and endurance and resilience in the midst of adversity. So if you, like me, have been in youth ministry and you go, well, I think I have an idea what I'm doing, I just don't know how to minister into suicide and depression, or into anxiety, or into family instability. This summer program is a program I want to call your attention to. This particular series has leading scholars from around the country on the questions of anxiety, poverty, idolatry, spirituality, and substance abuse. I know these are on the burner with every single person who works with our young, weighs on the heart of everyone who works with our young, and we're pulling together resources to equip you to minister into these spaces. I hope you'll consider coming. And last but not least, I want to introduce Carolyn Hardin Engelhardt. Carolyn, if you would just stand. Carolyn is an amazing resource for all of you because she directs the Yale Ministry Resource Center, which is part of our library. In 1991, when I was thrown in as an intern into youth ministry at the Guilford Congregational Church, I ran right to that Ministry Resource Center in 1991. It had books, videos, facilitated exercise, curriculum materials, amazing. You'll want to talk to Carolyn about that resource for your youth ministry. And she always loves to give a tour right after this lecture if you would like to join her. So find Carolyn after this lecture. And now I'd like to introduce my partner in the Adolescent Faith and Flourishing program of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and in the Yale Youth Ministry Institute, Dr. Sarah Farmer.
Happy New Year! Can you believe it's 2018? Well, it is with sheer delight that I get to introduce our presenters for today. And I want to start with introducing Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, who is an educator, writer, and the current dean of the Boston University School of Theology in Boston, Massachusetts. At BU, she is also professor of theology and education. Now, before going to BU, she was professor of religion and education, both at the Claremont School of Theology, as well as at Emory University, where she served as the director of the Women in Theology and Ministry program. Among her many books include Teaching as a Sacramental Act, a work I still love to teach in my religious education courses, Ministering with the Earth, Covenant and Call, and Teaching from the Heart, plus 3 edited volumes, Children, Youth, and Spirituality in a Troubling World, Practical Theology and Hermeneutics, and A Living Tradition, Critical Recovery of the Wesleyan Heritage. Dr. Moore's passion is to journey with others to cultivate deeper faith, compassionate humanity, and a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. But I must say that introducing Dean Moore is special to me because she was one of my first mentors as a seminary student. So I met Dean Moore bright-eyed, fresh out of college, with this vision of how I wanted to change the world. And Dean Moore has journeyed with me. As my professor, it was her careful attention to making class a rigorous yet meaningful experience in both what she taught and how she taught it that really contributed to my own interest in pursuing a PhD and become a practical theologian who teaches in the area of religious education. Besides being her mentee and former student, I also worked with Dean Moore as an administrator and interviewer with the Wisdom of Youth Project, research project, which has been a really long, careful endeavor to tend to and learn from the voices of young people. Dr. Moore believes that young people actually have wisdom and that we actually need to know that wisdom. The last thing I want to highlight is that over the last 10 years of knowing Dr. Moore, she has only grown more beautiful, more graceful, and more wise. And so it's really with great pleasure that I introduce Dean Moore. With her is Yara Gonzalez-Justiniano, who is a PhD student in practical theology at Boston University. In the short time I've known her, one of the things I admire about her is her deep knowledge of the history of her home, Puerto Rico. When talking to her, the love and commitment she has for Puerto Rico in both her research and advocacy is obvious. Within practical theology and youth ministry, her voice is needed and will contribute much to our understanding of hope in ecclesiology. On top of her research, she also works with theopoetics, which is a new movement that explores where faith, art, imagination, and embodiment intersect. Currently, she is under care with Christian Church Disciples of Christ in pursuit of ordination. Will you join me in welcoming today Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore and Ms. Yara Gonzalez.
I want to begin by saying how grateful that Jada and I are to have the opportunity to be here, and also how challenged we have been by the theme of joy. This past 2 years, past 3-4 years, has not been a time of joy. Our world is riddled with war and violence. Our country is stepping back in its care and justice for immigrant people, for people who can't afford health care, and so forth. This is not a political statement. It's a statement of existential pain. We have different theological and political and social perspectives on what needs to be done. But the pain is something that we all feel in one way or another. So the challenge of addressing the issues of joy in the midst of this pain are huge. Thank you for that challenge. And Jada and I have had a lot of fun working on this, a lot of fun. Oops, that was a little loud. So our first question is, what can youth tell us about joy? We think that youth often have clues that adults have tuned out long ago, and they have clues that awaken us to what joy is and what it can be, and what it can do in our lives and in our world. So we seek to explore the wisdom shared by youth, especially about joy, and the meaning of joy in young lives. And we'll say more about all of those, so I'll rush through these framing slides, but we want to give you a kind of big idea of where we're going and why. So we are working on those questions, and we're primarily working on those questions by listening to young people. We have 3 waves of research that we've engaged. ethnographies, interviews, and a case study of young people in Puerto Rico. Now, these date back to 1995. The first wave was roughly 1995 to 2005. The second wave of interviews was 2005 to the present time, continuing. And the third wave is some very fresh new research that Yara has just completed as she has been pondering how to respond and how to be with others who are responding to the present disastrous situation in Puerto Rico. So our primary task is to listen to youth and then to reflect on how leaders and scholars can value and enhance the wisdom that youth offer and contribute to celebration and resilience in young lives. Now, since we've been here, and before we came, we've heard a lot of stories about the kinds of ministries that you folks are engaged in. So we're expecting that part of what we're saying are things you've been working on for a long, long time, and that you already know better than we do, which is a good thing because this is collaborative work we're engaged in. But what we're hoping will come from it is that we're going to all learn from one another, and most especially learn from young people. So we didn't begin by developing, but we went back and developed working definitions of joy and wisdom. And we concluded that a working definition of joy is a complex of feelings or passions that uplift the self and are the community. Now, the next two pieces are important. They're going to come back to us later, but they emanate from internal processes and decisions that people make. It's easy to think that joy happens because we wake up and it's sunny. And listen, I live in New England too. When I wake up and see the sun, I just go, woohoo. But that's not all there is to joy. Joy comes from inner feelings, and it comes from decisions we make. We decide to be joyful, even in the face of terrible disaster. And it's shaped by our internal qualities, but that'll come back later. So what is wisdom? We offer a working definition: the deep knowing that persons develop as they engage with their experiences, accumulated knowledge, and active interpretations of the world. Now, we offer those for those of you who love definitions. If you don't like definitions, just forget it. Don't worry about it. But both joy and wisdom are intimately related to celebration, our fiesta, and resilience. They are markers of flourishing. They are hard work, they are gifts from God, and they are markers, contributors to flourishing. So we've written this poem that kind of captures some of what we've worked on over the last several months. I'm not going to read the full poem because of time, but I am going to start by reading a few lines. Joy is gozo, full of feeling, full of sensation, feeling the world, feeling the pain, feeling the flow of life with passion. Joy is pleasure, wonder, delight, rejoicing, jubilation. It is not a controlled body of emotions that numbs the negative and holds only to the positive. It's a state of being that, I'm reading the whole thing after all, that you carry within you and share with the world. A decision you make to feel fully, to live fully, to wonder at the pearl that grows from the grit and the oyster, to be awed by the potential of celebration and resilience in a world compromised by greed and violence. To delight in a creation and human family that have the capacity to repair themselves and live more fully in joy and hope. So the next section we're going to draw from the first two streams of research that have flowed into this, the ethnographies and the interviews. I'm going to present this fairly quickly. I'm not going to say something about everything on the screen, but I want you just to be aware that this lecture has provided the opportunity for us to go back 25 years, a little more than 25 years, to go back and collect the data from the past, the data that we just collected in the last year, and this new study that Jada has just been doing. So the first part of this presentation is just a broad sweep of some of the pictures, photographs of what we've learned in the first two aspects of this research. And these streams of study represent other streams across the earth. So this is one of the reasons we wanted to go back this 25 plus years, is because you never know enough. You can't know enough. And therefore, it's an ongoing project. It's not, you don't do a little study and that's it. You keep studying and learning. So when youth speak to joy and flourishing, there are four themes that emerge in their words. Now, I want you to know that these themes came out of analysis. So we didn't just invent them. We didn't go in with these themes and then try to prove them or tack on stories that fit the themes. These are the themes that came out of what the young people said and what they did. And I'm going to say a little bit about each one, but I'm just going to share one story from each one. Here I'm going to share the story that's represented in the second dot. Hee Kyung, this is a pseudonym, by the way. Hee Kyung was an active member in a Korean American congregation, and a member of that church raped her. She was so angry that she wanted to do something about it. And as she talked with her family and the pastor, they encouraged her to be quiet. And she began to realize that she wasn't actually the first victim of rape by this man in this congregation, but no one had said a word. So she was determined to make a difference. So she reported this rape, much to the horror of her family. She reported the rape. The man was brought to justice, and then she did one more thing. She said to us in the interview, "I am not going to let that man have my church." So she stayed in the church in order to claim her ground as a part of this community and not cede it to this man who had violated her. So joy comes from the wisdom of struggle. Wisdom comes from tragedy and suffering. Again, when we started this research, this is not what we expected to find. But the young people with whom we talked and the young people we spent time with in congregations told story after story about tragedy and suffering. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but what I do want to say is that the suffering and the tragedy that they experienced often led to a period when they thought more deeply about their lives, about their faith, about what God was calling them to do. So it became fruitful in terms of developing their own wisdom. They would have much preferred to develop wisdom another way. You don't have to suffer in order to be godly. But suffering sometimes comes, whether we invite it or not, and when it comes, it opens some doors that sometimes we have to reflect on in order to survive. And that's what these young people were often doing. So the third theme is strength from supportive community. And, oops, I went a little too far there. Let me just share the first one here. The congregational studies were done in congregations, Protestant and Roman Catholic congregations, different ethnicities, and some different parts of the country. And one of the things we learned from this particular Navajo Roman Catholic parish is that the youth said that the church helped them to come together, to celebrate as Navajo people, and to pray for their families and themselves. Now, these are young people who are living in poverty, and they are young people who don't know their own Navajo language, and they depend on the elders to help them learn their Navajo culture. So for them, coming together is life-saving work. It's not just fun, it's not a bonus, but it's life-saving work. We heard something similar in a multi-tribal urban Protestant congregation where the youth said that they loved their congregation because the people in their congregation were strong and because they cared for each other. They knew that the elders and the other youth in their congregation had their backs. And furthermore, in a vast urban area, it was the only place they could gather as Native Americans. Everywhere else, people would think they were Latinx or some other ethnic community. They'd kind of blend in. They had friends all over the place in their schools and so on, but here they could be Native American, and they could claim that heritage and learn the heritage. And even though they didn't speak their own native tribal language, they could sing. There were several songs that they could sing in Cherokee and Chickasaw and Navajo and so forth. I don't want to make this too glib, because there were also people who cried out, young people who cried out because of the lack of community in their churches. So in one Korean American church, for example, which had a large youth group, the young people complained because they had an in-group and an out-group. And the in-group, roughly 30 people, and the out-group, roughly 30, had groups within groups. So they felt like they weren't a part of a supportive community. They might be part of a clique, but that wasn't the same. And finally, the power for being real with others. And these dots all come from the same Roman Catholic parish, urban parish in Southern California. And when we studied this church, a very interesting thing happened. A protest broke out in the middle of worship one Sunday morning. And another thing that happened soon after that was a big argument developed in the youth group a couple of weeks later on a Sunday evening. And in this case, the two researchers who happened to be visiting there at the time, one was a European American man from a very traditional background, and another one was a Latina woman who actually had lived in this same neighborhood for some time. And he said, when we got to the analysis part, he said, "I think this church is falling apart. They just fight all the time." And the Latina woman said, think again. Think again. Maybe you're looking at them through your eyes. Maybe those fights and arguments mean something different to them. So the next week when he went back, he said, "So tell me about these arguments you were having last week. What do they mean? What's going on?" And they said, "We're family. That's what you do in a family. When you have an issue, you put it on the table and you talk about it." That completely transformed our interpretive lens for this Roman Catholic parish. So being real with others is critically important.
Good afternoon, everyone. Trying to think about the time of the day. So as part of what Dr. Moore was saying previously in terms of thinking about joy and wisdom and all these themes, being also in tune with what's happening constantly, it's very overwhelming, but it's also very necessary. And so this is how this case study came into place in this presentation. So as you can see up there, that didn't come a little odd. So after the hurricane, if you see that blue dot, that's where Puerto Rico is supposed to be. It's a satellite picture that's been circulating online. And just basically seeing how the island was left after the hurricane, and you also see Tortola and St. Thomas in the same picture, right? In terms of the devastation and what was there and what is not there anymore. So for this workshop, we took into account diverse and various settings of Christian youth ministries where we could observe a correlation of wisdom, of the wisdom of joy through resilience and celebration in the face of suffering, struggles and global tensions, as all these things just come together. So we are bringing into this conversation the context of Puerto Rico doing ministry after a national catastrophe Latinx immigration and the transformation of youth ministries in the United States as church has become more and more multicultural. So it's just like all these things coming together. So statistics from 2016 show that amongst the demographics of Latinx immigrants to the United States, the majority of its population is younger than 18 years old. In Puerto Rico, there are 3.5 million people, and after Maria, over a little 3 months afterwards, over 270,000 people have already immigrated to the United States. And most of these populations are young families. And also taking into account that, according to statistics, predominantly in the island of Puerto Rico, the majority are Christian, from a Christian faith, either Catholic or Protestant. So all these things take into place the way that we're thinking about ministry, doing ministry in whatever context you're in. All these things either directly or indirectly impact the work that you do. Before the hurricane, Puerto Rico, and this is just basically setting a little bit of the stage of what it's meant before and during the hurricane. So before the hurricane, Puerto Rico's economy and social political situation was already in dire conditions, and Maria exacerbated the situation. So 40 out of 78 municipalities have reported that 50% of their population were living in poverty, and this was in March 2017, so before the hurricane happened. And then after Hurricane Maria, suicide rates went up over 17%. And over 200,000 homes were destroyed. And the unemployment rate was 10.4% in July, and then after September, these numbers have doubled. So more than added to that, more than half of the island is still without power, and many are still without running or potable water. So this has been an experience that is ongoing and has impacted the collective as well as the individual. It has been a collective and personal trauma where all aspects of life, routine, and systemic enterprises have been impacted. And it has required attention of the community as a whole, but it also has required attention to diverse needs of particular groups. So for example, the elderly and pertaining to our work, the youth. So see, like talking about joy is a little bit difficult in these contexts. But one of the institutions, however, in the midst of all this, that has really mobilized and responded to the need of the people in the aftermath of Maria has been the church and other religious organizations. So the church has rolled up their sleeves and gotten to work by distributing food and supplies. As you see there, that's a picture of a Presbyterian church back in Puerto Rico, and the children are part of this endeavor. It's a collective trauma, it's a personal trauma, but it's also a collective endeavor of work and of resilience and of moving forward. So this kind of work has revealed the need to include every one of its church members. And I want to say that every one of its church members. Many of these volunteers you see working and being out there are youth and young adults who are getting involved and they're taking initiative in the endeavors of these communities to rebuild and survive. So it's not just that, a group of adults have organized this, it's just also youth and young people are given their opinions and either asking what to do or giving suggestions of what to do in a larger or smaller scale. For example, I have a story of this maybe 6-7-year-old girl who asked their parents if they could please get things for one of her classmates because she lost her home and lost everything. So she got her all the school supplies and everything she needed to go to school. And that, that detail and that aspect of taking, not just caring, but also being responsible for one another in these moments. So the reflection from various pastors in the island around the involvement of youth has been the need they have to be included and to participate. This sense of purpose and usefulness in the face of hopelessness and loss, we argue that it fosters joy. Taking part of what's happening around us and discovering one's sense of agency as a contributor ignites the youth's flourishing, which sustains a joy that moves away from self-gratification. The importance of understanding context and the particularity from which each of our youth members come from, not just what they believe or what their theology is, but it helps us shape and articulate a deep understanding of joy wisely. To speak about joy and flourishment in this context as a context of struggle and despair is a form of resistance. So I am recently, as in past Monday, I'm returning from spending the holidays at home. And although for many celebrating the holidays was a privilege, which means that they had enough access to food and electricity and a job to get the things that you needed to celebrate, or just food, right? This does not diminish the sense of sorrow or covered up the social realities, right? The celebration didn't mean that people forgot. But nonetheless, people in whatever scale they could found joy in fiesta. So fiesta means party in Spanish, but in a different way, in a not just party, but also celebration. So every time that there's a fiesta is a celebration of some sort. So the joy found in celebration of Christmas, in the celebration of family, community, and resilience. Joy in a context of struggle does not mean to alienate from the present material realities, but the empowerment of choice. Some youth, like Anna as a pseudonym, expressed the joy she found in the strength she received from God. So in places of struggle and devastation, the affirmation of God's presence through resilience produces joy and a sense of agency.
We've traveled from the three streams now to some theological reflection, and we think we've made some discoveries. We think that if we could spend an afternoon with you reflecting on these things, it would make more discoveries. But we hope our discoveries have some meaning for you. I'm not going to go through this entire page, but I want to call attention to the title, Joy as a Theological Game Changer. It arouses us to reflect on theologies of celebration, resilience, and wisdom. And the elements of joy as a theological game changer are presented here in this slide. We could add other elements, but around the edges, please note that joy is a gift of God. That is one of the things we learned from these stories, these words from the youth, the wisdom of youth. Joy is a practice to be cultivated. And the very practice enables us to be more deeply joyful and more deeply connected to God and one another and God's creation. And joy can transform the world one corner at a time. That's not intended to be glib, because joy doesn't always transform the world. People get crushed. People commit suicide. People go into deep despair. So joy doesn't always make things better, but it offers a promise. And it's that promise that we can decide to set our heart on. It doesn't mean that everything is gonna be better, but it means that we're going to be stronger and in stronger relationship with God and God's creation as we face whatever this world is offering us at this moment in time. So some of the theological elements of what we discovered are here on the screen, and you can read them for yourself. But I will highlight a couple of them. The top right corner, theology arises from practices and is fed by practices. That disrupts much of the way we do theology in the world. Often we think we have to learn theology and then apply it. This is very different. This is making a case from the youth standpoint that their practices have actually evoked their theological insight, and then those insights feed back into other practices. Two of the people that we've reflected on in this earlier section of the paper that we haven't presented here are His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Two people who have endured more struggle in their two lives than most two cities endure. They have endured enormous struggle and they have somehow persisted. His Holiness the Dalai Lama does not even know if there will be another Dalai Lama after he dies. And that tradition of a Dalai Lama within Tibetan Buddhism is critical. And yet, when he faces it and when he's asked about it, he laughs. He said, I have no control over that. I hope there will be, but my life is intended to live as it is, live to the fullest now. And I have to let that go. That is practicing joy. The middle one I'll also name, struggle is a faithful response to a hurting world. Gentility, ignoring reality, turning our eyes away from hurt is not a faithful response. Struggle is a faithful response to a hurting world. Sometimes we have to turn away, but even that can be a turning away in a struggle. Turning away for a time in order to continue the struggle. So theologically, we think the wisdom of youth is incredibly rich.
And then, so these are a couple of taking into what we've read and learned and struggled with ourselves. There are a couple of practices for those who love youth, things we encourage you and encourage people to reflect on while they're doing youth ministry. So one is to encourage young people to live into their struggles. There's many people that say, and this has been coined by Latinx theology, que la vida es lucha, that to live is to struggle. So living through the struggle means going through the lucha, this struggle, this lucha. But also understanding that lucha is translated as struggle, but lucha is also a fight. So it's not just a struggle that you're just like in the same place stuck. It doesn't mean to be stuck and struggling by being stuck. It means moving forward, right? It means pushing through. So lucha has a combination of this. So many of the youth interviewed in the interviews that Dr. Moore did as we were reading them, they share their experiences and stories of overcoming a difficult situation and how this strengthened their faith and themselves and their understandings of God as God's accompanying them through this struggle. And that's what living into the struggle means. So by any means, as Dr. Moore said previously, it doesn't mean to glorify suffering. It doesn't mean that we have to suffer to be godly. It just means that what we get when we are just living into this in faith and in the sense of overcoming, but not just overcoming and getting to the next level, just knowing that God is accompanying us through this journey. The second one is create opportunities for young people to draw wisdom from tragedy and suffering. So tragedy and suffering rarely arise from understandable and natural realities. Maybe like a natural catastrophe as a hurricane, but also you see all the things that were in place before to create those means that getting up and actually recovering faster or recovering at all make it more difficult because all these things that were in place before are not natural realities, are made realities. but nonetheless, they cry out to be interpreted. So by creating these opportunities where young people can draw wisdom from this, is this cry out to interpret these places of struggle that sometimes make no sense. Because young people seek to make meaning and create life-giving responses to the injustices and the difficult situations around them. A third invitation is to invite youth into communities that support resilience and joy. So the invitation to understand the search of joy through the practice of resilience promotes an active hope that leads to Fiesta, that leads to this celebration. As we look into, the ecological, political, and socioeconomic future of the United States, or in the case that we presented as Puerto Rico, the hope for a fruitful and sustainable world to come, the world to come for younger generations, can be hindered. So the combination of resilience and joy awakens a hope that does not fall into false optimism and delivers us from nihilism. So much of the emphasis in youth ministry I have encountered is around leadership and discipleship, which is wonderful, but then part of the work we also need to do with our youth is to dedicate time to speak and understand the work of joy. The work of gozo, as Dr. Moore was saying in the poem, the work of gozo in our lives, and what does it mean to live it out faithfully. Another invitation is to encourage young people to be real with one another and with others. So here in the face of trauma and struggle, young people need to share honestly, and those sometimes creates very uncomfortable conversations, but also a lot of unexpected conversations that maybe as a youth minister you're not prepared to answer. But it is in these moments where our faith and our communities get tested, and sharing honestly allows youth to discover the work through their struggles and see that they're not alone. But then also what it creates is a deeper understanding of God, a deeper understanding of their relationship to God, their relationship to the community, their relationship to each other by being honest. Another practice that we encourage you is to encourage young people to question, reshape, and deepen their theologies continually, which is very connected to the honest sharing. So youth are naturally filled with questions, and the traumas and struggles of their lives evoke more. They are hungry to rethink how God can be present when the world is still in tatters, or how God cares for the poor, whom the world ignores and mistreats, or how God can love creation even while people suffer and the globe warms. Young people need opportunities to ponder what it means for God to suffer with us, or for God to work in and through us, and for God to endure even when people have unraveled justice and compassion. Thus, youth need to be encouraged in their theological questioning, accompanied by God and one another. They need encouragement to hold doubt with respect. They will never have all answers they seek, but their theologies can expand and deepen the quest, and the quest will go on. So such a theology is not a weak theology, but a strong one, recognizing that God is much bigger than all our theologies put together, that the mystery of God is a reminder of God's wonder and our own human limits and understandings. So one of the things that I will share with you, when I went home, I asked my pastor in my local church if they needed anything. By this, I meant, do you need batteries? Do you need, what do you need, cans of food? And he said, I need you to preach next Sunday. Great. I'm gonna preach next Sunday. So it was this constant, what am I gonna preach about question, right? And I'm asking him, well, are you just, to piggyback on whatever he has been doing, do you have a theme? Is there anything you're working with? He's like, nope, you do what the Spirit leads. I'm like, great, thank you, appreciate this, Señor. So it was a lot of discernment, a lot of praying, right, to see like in this, I don't know what, I literally had no idea what I was going into because I hadn't been there, aside from the pictures that I've received from family members and stuff that people were posting. So I had no idea what I was going into in terms of what have all these people in a very communal way had been experiencing, but also in a very personal way had been experiencing. So they all experienced a hurricane, but not all, some of them lost their homes. Some of them, you know, they all have very different particularities. And what my pastor said, well, people just need to know that God is still here. And okay, I'm gonna preach about that. And that made me go, not rethink, just go deeper into understanding the ways that God is with us, even when all these things. So that's basically what we're asking you to do when in terms of reshaping and rethinking theology is going deeper into understanding our images of God and our interactions with God. Elizabeth Thomas, in her recent article called In Rethinking Latino Youth Ministry, Frameworks that Provide Roots and Wings for Our Youth, she argues about the need of going back to the drafting table and to reshape and rethink the ways in which we are doing a ministry that listens to the times. Right? We're all constantly wanting to do a ministry that listens to the times. And Thomas clearly speaks about creating models for Latinx ministries that are their own. And although she's specifically talking about this, I do believe that youth, as going through a process of identity and self-defining, need to constantly be exposed to a model that is their own. So we argue that this reshaping and rethinking desperately needs to impact our theologies and the ways that we present God, again, our images and our interactions. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
We're going to pick up some Q&A now. But because we are recording, we need to have your questions microphoned. So if you have a question for Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore or for Yara Gonzalez-Justiniano, please just raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone so that you can pose the question, and then we'll ask for a response. Who has a question today?
Hi, I'm Reverend Catherine King. I'm pastor of the West Haven Congregational Church. And I have a question in terms of a statement that, a very positive statement that you made in terms of the importance of youth being authentic and real, coming together and having opportunities for that. My other idea is that in order to do that, there also has to be a safe environment so that as people expose themselves, they don't have to worry about retaliation. And creating that is a whole nother object or project. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
I think you should start on this one, John.
Okay. I think there are definitely many ways to answer this because there's so many possibilities on how to do this work. And I experienced it in terms of what does it mean to have a safe space in a classroom, right? Which is a little different than a church. So one of the things that can happen is that there's no safe space, that we're always going to say things that will hurt one another or things that we're still dealing with and struggling with. And I think that a lot has to do with the work that we already do with young people, the work that the seeds that we're already planting in our ministry. So a lot of the difficulties that I see is that a difficult topic comes along and then we want to discuss it, right? And then we're doing the circle and we're sharing. But now there's no previous work done, right? We don't have the practices or we don't know how to dialogue and go into these circles in a way that we create safe spaces, right? I struggle with that term because there's conflict, right? There's struggle in discussions and conversations, and was what the example that Dr. Moore was talking about in terms of how do people hash out things, right? They're very different. And in terms of a church context, I would hope that in the ways that you create and foster community, right, that the relationships that are already established with this group that we're working with are already, because you're already doing the work, right? The work doesn't start when you get people together, you have been already doing the work. So I think it goes into thinking about your mission and thinking about the ways you think about ministry, the things the outcomes that you want to have with the youth that you're working in ministry. So preparing yourself, right? You have to do the work yourself in order to see how you can foster these spaces so when something arises and there's conflict, you can have these dialogues and have these conversations and know that there are things that are already in place that are going to create a safe space, not because there's not going to be conflict, but because the people in that group are going to take care of each other, right? And are going to do things lovingly, regardless of the struggle and regardless of the conflict that might arise. So I think it's also like not being afraid of creating, like having conflict, and also knowing how do you train yourself and prepare yourself when there is conflict and you don't know how to deal with it. It's very important to also recognize that in order to stop and say we need to pick this up, or this strategy doesn't work, we need to rethink the way that we're approaching this topic.
I think I'll join in on this one because two things that you said, Jada, I think are especially critical based on our research. And one of them is to do work on yourself. And that's not work, work, work. It's spiritual deepening work. That kind of daily spiritual deepening is part of making it possible to be able to create safe spaces. I'm going to come back to that. And the other one is that you facilitate that among the youth. Mm-hmm. And encourage them to facilitate it among themselves. That's one of the biggest insights of the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu is that there's a lot of work that they have at the end of their book called the Book of Joy. They have what they call joy practices. There's a lot of work, very rewarding work in practicing joy and in cultivating the capacities within yourself and within the larger community. In saying those two things, I'm really just building on what Jada already said, but I want to add one more piece, which you also added, and that is there's no such thing as a safe space. And to begin with that acknowledgement is extremely helpful because you're not promising safe space. However, God's kingdom, or God's new creation, helps us to lean into safe spaces, to lean into communities that are healthier. So I think one of the biggest tasks, joys of being in youth ministry is creating culture. Creating a culture in which people feel free to express themselves when they're encouraged not to say anything they're going to be sorry they said, but if they happen to say something they're sorry they said, take time to reflect with them on this. If things happen not to go so well in one particular week or month, then take time, keep going back to the table. Don't leave people dangling just because you had an uncomfortable moment. And that's all about creating culture, which means creating practices that open us to the possibility of more genuine interaction with dignity with others. I think we can create spaces that respect the dignity, the inherent sacred worth of every being, even though they will never be completely safe.
Questions?
So just recently, two of my young people, their sisters, lost their mother. And how can I help them find joy in the current struggle that they're in regarding their mom's death?
I guess like for me, it's hard to say. I can think about the ways, I guess like it's just very particular too in terms of in which ways they can remember their mother in a way that their mother is still alive. So, but I don't know their particular situation. So I'm thinking specifically about when my mom lost her mom. My mom was about my age. And the ways that she finds joy, and even in this process, I remember, so my grandmother passed away from cancer, and my mom finds joy, aside from the fact that, you know, she celebrates my grandmother's life, she finds joy that she knows she did everything that was in her power to be with my grandmother during that time and care for her. And so the stories that I've heard from people who've gone through this, the joy has been in the way that they've lived life with this person alongside. And remembering that and in knowing that they lived a full life in terms of their relationship with each other. So I say it's particular because I don't know if this is the case, but at least for me, that's one way that I've seen it. And seeing also how, so I was little when this happened. I was 9 years old. And the way that I coped with it and managed it was that constantly, because this was a progressive illness in my grandmother. So, I mean, it's not that it was a sudden death, which also plays a different role when it's something like this. But I do remember constantly the way that it was presented to me as a child is that death is a part of life. This is part of the circle and the cycle, and it's how you live your life, right? It's how you work through this process into being with your grandmother. And so for me, as being with my grandmother, it was people asking me, well, have you enjoyed being with her? Have you taken care of her? Or have you spent time with her? So things like that it's the accompanying, right? It's the living life together. And it's also the fact that you can find joy in the life they have doesn't mean that it's not held in tension or at the same time with sadness and suffering, right? It doesn't mean that these two things can't coexist with each other.
I might add 3 words: time, giving time to people. Secondly, being with. You can't fix it. So just being with. And the third is finding the joy in mourning. I've done a lot of mourning in the last year. And the very practice of mourning, the very experience of mourning is filled with joy. It's filled with joy if you had a wonderful relationship, because all the memories that Jada was talking about come back. It's filled with joy if you had a relationship where you did caregiving and that person, even in a very incapacitated state, was able to relate with you in ways that were precious. But mourning is also a gift when you're mourning the brokenness of a relationship. What you didn't do, what this person did against you. There's a certain joy in being able to open that up. Opening wounds is not easy, but there's a joy in being able to open it up, because often death provides that opportunity. I love what Mary Moshola says about the companionship between joy and suffering. And I think mourning is a good example of where joy and suffering often are commingled.
Thank you. Other questions for our guests?
Thank you. I just had a question. This is relative to some things that I've seen going on, but I think recent estimates suggest that there's about 174 deaths every day of youths for drug overdoses in the U.S. And I'm wondering, in this myth, where's the joy as you're mentoring to someone who has maybe just went through treatment programs and they're wanting to reintegrate, but they can't go back to their circle, which they were there in, with places and different people. So how, or what do you suggest in bringing them particularly back into a new fold to experience new joys? And I don't know, just comment on that. Thanks.
I think that is a wonderful question, and we can come back to how we might respond, but I see Q&A as not just Q&A, but a discussion. So I wonder if anyone is inspired to give your own answer to this question.
Well, let's see. Okay, so there's this young girl, and one of the fellas inside the company has asked her to go to Jordan's IT. And she had problems with addiction. So now there's this, even though she's struggling and has come out of a rehabilitation center and is striving, in different areas to do different things, this is something she may not have done before. So it was just a little thing, and a gesture that brought her into taking steps. So she climbed up to the top of this thing. I don't know if any of you know what this IT is. It's this indoor, climbing situation where you're on a harness and you walk, and above, everybody's on, the ground's beneath you, and there's different levels to this thing. So the interesting thing was for her to take this first step, stepping out onto this thing. And so it's sort of like a representation of taking a step to do something new. She probably wouldn't have done something like that before. So I think the joy there is all the new experiences that can come as a result of trying one thing that may be new or different, and maybe attempting to hold the hand or to offer that to the individual to bring them to a different place.
Yeah, of course. So, thank you for that. See, that was brilliant that you asked the question and then you answered it, and I think it's brilliant. But I'd like to build on what you said. I think one of the gifts the church has that we don't even often realize we have is that we have the power and vocation to create alternate communities. Mm-hmm. We can become a center of healing justice. We can become a compassion generative community. And we can develop the practices that make our communities as welcoming, as full-bodied, as accepting, as respectful of dignity as any community can be. And that is a capacity that we often, I would say we often, maybe even most often, don't enact, because it requires trust in God and trust in ourselves, and it requires a sense of vocation. So I do believe that churches can provide what you were just describing. That's one part of an answer. But I think you've just given an answer that's brilliant. And that is that young people often need guidance in discernment. So discernment of, so what might be next in my life? What might make my heart sing? How might I do one thing that would help me feel better in my skin and in this world? And that very often is developing a talent, music, dance, painting, sports. It's very often, and this comes out of the research, by the way, time and time again, kids are feeling so down on themselves, down on the world, down on everything, and they discover, because one person says, I think you may be talented in blank, give it a try. and they give it a try, and suddenly their whole life begins to change. So I believe that what you are suggesting is extraordinarily important, because it not only cultivates the gifts within the young person, but it also helps them connect with other communities. And finally, I'm talking too much, but I'm going to say one more thing. In this whole thing about creating community, we can engage in practices that allow us to be together in different ways. And different communities do that differently. Sometimes they have discussions about a movie or a song. Sometimes they go on an immersion trip where they engage with people whom they don't normally engage with. Sometimes they do a talking circle. And I want to accent this one, because there are Native Canadian and Native American communities that practice talking circles regularly. And there are other communities, especially those who are torn by conflict, who practice talking circles, where you pass the stick and you only speak when the stick or talking piece comes to you. And that is an amazing way to create a culture that allows people to be who they are now. Not who they were yesterday or who other people think they are, but to name themselves into the circle, to name their concerns, their gifts, their hopes into the circle. And I do believe that that kind of practice, as well as others that you already know and practice, are extremely important for young people to find a place for themselves, especially if the places that they have been connected are no longer healthy for them. You want to add anything?
No, that's perfect.
I promise I won't talk so
No, at all, please.
Other questions? Oh.
I was just going to piggyback on the person that talked about substance abuse, because that's a population that I have worked a lot with. One of the things that where I had different experiences in the prison and also outside in the community, and they, when you genuinely care, they know. One of the biggest things that I found that really changed in the relationship when I deal with them is you have to believe in them. You have to believe in them, even when they fail, and the sense of hope. I think those are important things that I had a young lady whom I was her probation officer, and she did not want to go to probation, and she didn't want nothing to do with probation because she couldn't stand anybody that had, that was part of law enforcement. And my task was that she needed to do certain things in the court. So she also had a problem with, she was prostituting because she needed to get the drugs. And so she was so angry when she first came in. She was just angry and upset and, told me this, told me that. And, I just listened to her. And you know what? And I acknowledge. I think one of the biggest things is not to minimize where these people come from, knowing that their struggle is real, knowing that their pain is real, knowing that, they passed through, she went through a lot. And when I actually acknowledge her pain, she then in turn changed. And she was able to calm down and talk to me. And then I said, well, and I gave her choices. Okay, what do you think you need? What do you want to do? Even though I had the control to dictate to her what she was going to do, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to come from her. And once I did that, and I let her have the control in that respect, even though I knew that ultimately she had to go to treatment, she went fighting. Oh my gosh, she fought that rehab. She fought it all the way. It was the first time she had gone to rehab. So I used to talk to the counselor and says, okay, how she's doing? Oh, she's doing it. When she graduated, she said, oh, she wants to speak to you. And I said, really? Yeah, she wants to speak to you. I said, okay. She says, can you come to my graduation? I mean, I was like, okay, doesn't she have a family member or someone else that can go with her? But I knew it meant so much to her. And that I told my supervisor, I'm going to go to this graduation. She needs me to be there because I need to be a support to her, because ultimately there's nobody else. And I have to say that I saw her a year ago, and she never forgets me. You know what I mean? We created a genuine bond. And I think relationship is so important in substance abuse, believing in that person, even if they fail, even if they do whatever. You know what? I know you can do this. I have hope. And that hope was instilled in her when she was able to go to that substance abuse treatment. So, and the joy was for her being able to complete the program, which she has never done before. And she was able to really address her abuse, because she had gone through a lot of abuse, but she never had dealt with that abuse. So the rehab program that she went was specifically for females, and that was the place that she went. So I will have to say that one step at a time. I know it's a cliche, one step at a time, but really it is one step at a time. Thank you.
All right, our time is almost up. Does anyone have one last question before we thank our guests?
Can I say? Oh, wait.
Oh, we have a
one.
postscript.
I have this thing right here. Thank you. In thinking about what you were saying and sharing, and some of the things the questions that there are, I was thinking about passion and commitment, and how both of them are really important in this work, but they're not the same thing. And passion can only get you as far, right? Because it's very important to be passionate and have passion in what you do, but the commitment, right? The commitment of going to that graduation, commitment in terms of keeping the conversations going and doing that circle and thinking about safety and challenges and thinking about confrontation. The commitment is the commitment, God's presence, and His accompaniment. But this commitment to see through the struggle, to see through the situation, which is what eventually, works through and produces joy and celebration.
And I'll add 2 PSs as well to this whole mix of conversation we've been having. One way to be with young people who are undergoing major transitions and challenges in their life is just to know that you're in it for the long haul. And that even when, sometimes young people who are going through these challenges take their anger out on you. Or they become very disruptive with other folks. And just sticking with it and being there for the long haul is amazing in its work. It's like the presence of God. God doesn't leave us when we are ugly to each other. God is still there, and I think if we're going to mediate the grace of God, we need to still be there. And the second PS that I want to add to this is going back to Jada's presentation of the young people in Puerto Rico. I think another way of being with young people when they're faced with huge challenges is helping them find ways, inviting them into significant work. In Jada's presentation, she calls attention to the fact that the youth in Puerto Rico are attracted to the churches and agencies that are doing something constructive to respond to people's needs. And just to give them the opportunity to participate in something constructive and at the same time to be working alongside others. The interesting thing about that is that Yara also said that the young people often come up with their own ideas then. They get into the work, and then they take initiative and make suggestions. And I think all of these are ways to involve young people and be present, walking with them on the long road toward God's kingdom.
Amen and amen. Thank you. Blessings on the ministries you are returning to, and we look forward to seeing you the first Wednesday of February for Professor David Ford and the Reverend Canon Chris Russell.